Hi, and welcome to part 5 of my Automating Active Directory with PowerShell tutorial series. In the last videos, we've learned how to import our CSV data, import our Active Directory data, and get like a very basic comparison of them. So let's just take a quick look to see what our code does currently. So we have these 3 functions right now. And then our main script, we have a sync field map, which maps our CSV columns to AD properties. And we have a couple little global configurations like our CSV file path, our delimiter, our domain, and our unique ID, which is basically the property that is our primary key or our like unique identifier, which basically tells us how the employees are unique in a way. So they're not unique by name, but they are unique by employee ID. So if we run all of these commands here and our compare users, so we do get our results back, but right now we only get the employee ID and whether they're in the file or Active Directory or in both based on these side indicators. So what we want to do today is really get a user data sync, which basically what that kind of means for me anyways, is really get the data back of what needs to be added, what's synced, and what needs to be removed. And I want all the data related to that. So the way that I think about it is we already know the steps is we need to get the new users, the synced users, and the removed users. Now, you could do this in 3 separate functions. In fact, when I was first creating this project, that's what I did. But then I decided to kind of merge them into one function and return them in a hash table. And that actually was a lot more efficient by about 100%. So it halved the processing time on that. So that's the way that I'm going to be showing it in this tutorial. So firstly, what we really want to do is kind of break this problem down. So we need to get the new users, the synced users, and the removed users. So what we're going to go ahead and do is we're going to work down here, and then we're going to create the function for it, because that's the way that I kind of like to do things here. So what we're going to do is we're going to do a compare data, and then we're just going to get that to our compare data here. So we're holding that in a variable now. So now we can quickly see what's in there and what's not in there. So we already know that this 00 is not in our CSV file and only in our Active Directory. So this icon for us, the arrow pointing towards the left needs to be deleted. The arrows pointing towards the right need to be added. And if it's a double equal sign, we know it's synced. We don't have any currently in there, but that's what the side indicator would be as we saw in the last video. So let's go ahead and let's create some variables here. So we're going to do new user ID or new user's ID actually, because there's going to be more than one potentially. And then we're going to have a synced users ID. And then we're going to have removed users or remove users ID. I think that makes more sense instead of removed. Oh, I guess they could be removed because they were removed in the past. All right, so what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to basically set these IDs to the employee ID in the compare data. So what we're going to do is we're going to take our compare data variable here, and we're going to pipe that to where side indicator, let me just make sure I spelt that correctly. I did. And we're going to put that to equals. And we know that the new ones are pointing towards the right. And all we're going to do is we're going to copy this line here, all the 3 other ones, and we're going to put double equals. And then for the removed users, we're going to put the arrow pointing towards the left, sorry. So what we're going to do is we're going to run this. And now if we look at this here, we see that we get all just the new users. The synced users should come back empty, and then the removed users should only come back as 1. So that's perfect. So now what we want to do is we want to get the data for these. So what we're going to do is we're going to do our new users. So this is going to be the actual new users. And then what we could do to get the new users, since they're not in our Active Directory, we can actually do get, I don't know why it's not. Go get employees from CSV. And then what we're going to do is we're going to pass in the file path. We're going to pass in our delimiter. We're going to pass in our sync field map. I think that's all this takes. So if we just run this here real quick just to see what we get, perfect. So we do get the data back. And now what we're going to want to do is, since we have our unique identifier here, what we're going to do is we're going to pipe this over to where unique ID is going to be, we're going to have that as being, I believe it's the in parameter here. So let me just take a look here to see if there's an in. Yep, there is. And then we're going to see if it's in the new users.id, but we're also going to specify, oops, we don't want to type in employee ID because we want to make this able to change based on the unique ID if someone passes in a different one. Perfect. So that should work. So now if we get this here, now if we go look in our new users, these are all the new users here. Now this won't look very much different than just the get employee from CSV, but basically what it does is if we had, it'll only get the ones that we need. So in theory, see here how we have this Matthew Wilkins here with our employee ID. So if we actually came into our Active Directory here and we went into users and we took our test user, we're just going to go ahead and change his employee ID or her employee ID. This is really a test user. We don't really know. All right, so let's do a 100-111. And then we're just going to hit apply here. So now if we go ahead and run all of this now, we won't actually get that user. So if we go all the way to the top here, as you see, we do not get that user anymore. So the users will only gets basically all the users from our employee CSV file, but then only gets the one where the employee IDs are in this new user's ID, which we know is only from the compare data where they need to be added into Active Directory. That's how that works. So what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to create a line here like this for synced users and removed users. So let me just go ahead and let me just, actually, we're going to keep that way. This way we can see the synced users. So what we want to do is we want to create a synced users variable, and then we're going to get the employee from CSV again. We're just going to copy all of these here. And then we are going to pass that to where unique ID in synced users ID and then unique ID. So now if we run this, you will see that we will get that Matthew Wilkins user. Perfect, that's what we got. So now we only have one left to make here, which is our removed users. So this one's going to be slightly different because we know that removed users are users that aren't in the CSV file, but that are in our Active Directory. So what we're going to do in this case is we're going to get our employee from Active Directory, and then we are going to pass in the sync field map. And we are going to pass in the domain. And we are going to pass in the unique ID. And then we are going to pass that to where unique ID is in, you guessed it, the removed users ID dot unique ID. So now if we go here, now in this case, this should be empty, but we could actually create this one to actually have a value. So like we did before, is we're just going to go in here. We're going to take this test user here, and we are just going to set it to all zeros. And now if we run this here, if we check our removed users, we're going to see that we do get our test user back. Synced users will be empty again. And then we have all of our new users. So what we'll want to do is we want to return these as an output. Now, you can only return one object as an output, so that becomes our next problem, is how would we pass these? So like I said at the beginning, I pass them as a hash table, because a hash table has a key and it has a value. So we can easily get all the new users, all the synced users, and all the removed users by simply having a key. So what I like to do is we create a hash table like this. And what I like to do is just call it new. And then we have synced. And then we have removed. Oops. Removed. And then you can just do new users. Synced users. And removed users. So now if we run this here, we're going to see we get back a nice hash table with all the values in there. So now what we want to do is we want to put this into a function so we can easily call this later on. So let's go ahead and let's create a function here. So let's do our function get, and we're going to call it get user sync data. Then we're going to have our commandlet binding here. And then our parameters. Now we have to figure out what our parameters are. Now this is what I like about creating it first before just creating the function, because we'll know exactly what parameters we need. So we definitely need to take in the sync field map, the unique ID, the CSV file, the delimiter, the domain. And I think that's about it. So let's see here. We probably have another one that takes in those. Yeah, so it takes in the exact same thing as the compare object here. Now in theory, you could probably fit this into the compare object, but I kind of like to keep my functions very, as I said before, like just they do one thing only. This way, it's kind of like more like a module where if you would want to use this module to do other things than just automating your Active Directory, you could. So that's kind of why I do that. All right, so let's basically cut this out here and let's paste this into our function. And then let's just make it look pretty by tabbing these in. Perfect. So now that looks pretty good to me. The only thing we're going to want to do is wrap it in our try catch statement like we always do. Let's do that. And then as always in our catch statement, we'll just have a write error, $_ exception.message. So it'll just pass whatever error pops up. And that should be good. So what we're going to go ahead and do is we can actually comment this compare compare users here. And let's do get user data sync. Let's pass our sync field map, our unique ID, our CSV file path, our delimiter, and our domain. Perfect. And let's just run all of it. Perfect. So we do get our values back. So what I'd like to do now is just store this into a user data variable. We can actually remove this line now because we do not need it anymore. And the way that you would reference this later on is if you do a user data.new, you get all your new users. And then if we do a dot synced, you get all your synced users, which for us is none. And we have our dot removed, which is our removed users. Now you can name these anything you want. You can do new users, synced users, and removed users. That'll really work. But this is pretty much it for getting the user sync data. So that'll really get us all of our data that we need to then create our users, sync our users, and remove them. So now that we know the next step in our script here, we know that the next step is to create a user. Now, before I get into that video will be quite long because there's a lot of steps in creating a user. We know that a user needs a username, and the username needs to be unique because that's how they're going to log in. So we're going to need to create some sort of function to give us a username and guarantee us that it is unique. Now, there's a lot of ways that we can create a username. A lot of them are ugly if you want to guarantee uniqueness and never have to change it. I'm going to be doing a last name first initial base username. That seems to be quite the standard for a lot of places. If your company is large, oftentimes it's easier to create a username with like the employee ID. And then you just have some extra work to kind of do some mapping for the email, making sure that you create them an email alias with their name, unless you give them an ID as well. When I went to university, I know that our university used first initial, last initial, and then the last 2 digits of the year you signed up to school, and then 2 random letters of the alphabet. That is also very, very good. Not a lot of change that's going to happen unless they do get married in the last, their initial of their last name changes. But if there's a typo in their name when you first create them, you don't really need to worry about it because it's not in their username. So that one's pretty good. It's pretty unique because you'll have letters of the alphabet and you have 2 first, like their first initial, last initial, and then the year. So every year you kind of have a new pool of usernames that you can use. And then after that, for every person, like my name would be RT, and then this year would be 21. So it'd be RT21, and then there'd be 26 letters of the alphabet and another 26 letters of the alphabet. So that would be 26 times 26 options for everyone that has the initials RT in the year 2021. So that's a lot of users. You can always use more. You can use numbers. I mean, you can do RT21 and then a random for integers. There's a lot of options here. I'm going to create the last name first initial. But by all means, you will always be able to create your own username function for this. Basically, if you call it the same and give it a different output, it'll still work. And then what we need to do is, again, this is kind of depends on your organizational needs. I'm going to create it this way for this video, is placing your users in an OU, so an organizational unit. A lot of people do based on geographical location, so that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to be using our physical office names. in order to create those. But by all means, I'll be creating it in a very dynamic way. So if you want to do it based on title, if you want to do it based on department, feel free. All you have to do is change the one variable value, and you'll be able to do that. As long as it's something that you keep track of in the CSV file, you will be able to use it. AOU. And then finally, creating the user. So what we're probably going to do in the next video is we're going to create the username function. And then what we're going to want to do is we're probably going to want to create some sort of function that makes sure that all the OUs are created based on the CSV file, and just make sure that we don't have one that's missing. If there is one that's missing, either do some sort of output telling us that it's not there, or in our case, what I'll be doing is I'll be creating the OU as part of the script, and it'll just output saying that it's creating it. And then finally, in the video after that, we'll go ahead and we'll start creating users. So that's the breakdown for the next videos. Please like and subscribe. Make sure you hit that notification bell to get when that username video comes out. I will see you on the next video.